Dr. Nzao, I must ask this. Somebody even asked, okay, if you say that some of these extremists are normally targeting who they call, quote unquote, you know, kafir, or people who do not believe in the religion,
Yes.
why is it that they would go to the heart of the religion? Clerics were gathering for a very important occasion that has to do with the religion.
Yeah, if we think like that, then we are getting it wrong. It's very sad that, you know, in fact, violent extremists, in terms of the Islamist extremism and violent extremism in the Islamic sense, now that is now the bigger political picture. And there might be need for another formula to approach it, because some of them now cease just to be a mere terrorist thing going on, but rather something just to do about the control of power and so on. And some of these groups can be easily co-opted and changed into just regular actors, like to be political parties and so on. But they're still very hardline stances and state-sponsored terrorism in the process, where other countries are involved, and beyond this target that is the you know, the conduit here, there are other people out there that those who are attacking are targeting. So it becomes a little bit murky with that kind of thing, and Afghanistan is quite protracted. As a conflict setting. And
clearly, coming from this scenario, maximum impact is what really matters. So some of these extremists, Ambassador Mwancha, speak on politics and terrorism, the link of those two, because it seems like with time, terrorism and extremism seems to be morphing to suit the need of the day.
Thank you. Politics and terrorism. First of all, as Dr. Nzao said, if you look at Afghanistan, there is a divergence in terms of the population as to how to receive particularly the foreign forces that are there. As you know, you have NATO forces there, you have the US forces, and to some people they will say they are under occupation, and therefore their politics will be, let's get rid of these foreign forces and fight. And of course you know that the Talibans, if you look at the history, first of all, they were supported by the West initially, to get rid of the Kabul government. And later on, they were supported by the Russians. And therefore, there has always been that external influence in the politics of Afghanistan. But answering your question generically, the terrorists would want, of course, to overrun a country, and therefore, one of the targets would be to remove the government of the day. And therefore, that in itself is politics, because for them, they are not going to use the ballot. They want to use the gun and acquire power. And once they acquire power, then, of course, they have a state that they can manage with their own ideology. And in most cases, if you look at, for instance, in the case of Boko Haram, the ideology was that let's get rid of Western influence in Nigeria. And of course, then they will see that the government that is in Abuja is under the Western influence, and get rid of them. So that is the link that is there between politics and...
Okay, now, Dr. Omai, Afghanistan has been trying to get its feet on the ground, but clearly for some, and especially this extremists, it looks like peace equals to loss on their part. So some of those places, for example, if you look at the Somalia situation, some would say they look at Mogadishu one way, and we look at Mogadishu another way, going by the pictures that are sent out of how Mogadishu looks like. But when we look at the headlines, we see turmoil, we hear war, we hear a failed state. So when it comes to this being a perennial issue, is it to ensure that certain political stance are actually kept, or what is the tactic behind this?
Most of the time when we have a state of conflict, there is a political economy that thrives. And of course, what they call a rentier state, you know, and so shadow economies, economies that are not realized, that are not part of the national GDP. And so you have many people coming in there to thrive with business. You heard about, like in Somalia, there's the accusation that we had the militaries, foreign militaries trading in charcoal.
Yes.
And so the challenge with conflict also, it allows all this, a political economy that is a shadow economy to thrive, that does not favor the people from that country. And piracy thrived for quite some time in Somalia. There's also, again, with the Taliban, a lot of rentier economy, and a rentier economy that is also thriving. So that's the challenge with having a state of conflict. There are people who are benefiting, and it doesn't benefit the real people, the real citizens. Or it's, again, it could be citizens, but who are benefiting from this state of conflict. DRC is another country, again, where because of the state of violence and conflict, there's a whole economy, a shadow economy that thrives based on the natural resources extraction that, again, doesn't help the state at that level. So that's the challenge with conflict, and why we need to get to dealing with violence, and not just violent extremism, but all forms of conflict.
Okay, so I guess the question would be how would we go about it? What are the solutions? How do you suck life out of this thing that seems to be a huge vicious cycle? And you will see it keeps going on and on in some of those countries that Dr. Omai has mentioned. Dr. Kanenje.
Number one, the current problem of terror a lot of times also has to be analyzed regionally or by country, because sometimes the circumstances are different. Now, the Islamic State has claimed responsibility for what happened in Afghanistan. And the Islamic State is neither Islamic nor is it a state, even though they claim to be. Part of the challenge in Afghanistan is political exclusion. After the Taliban was removed, remember, they were the government in Kabul. The largest ethnic group, the Pashtuns, have never felt sufficiently represented in the national government in Kabul. And as long as this large ethnic group, which also has a sizable presence in neighboring Pakistan, that is what part of what creates the Pakistan-Afghanistan dynamic, is going to be increasingly difficult. Now, of course, there seem to be hope on the horizon, especially with regard to the Taliban. I think a week ago there were talks in Moscow where the Taliban were represented. The US had an observer status in the meeting, which was different. Some Afghan delegates were represented in there in one room. Stuff like that hasn't happened in a very long time because, first of all, the US never wanted to negotiate with the Taliban. Now they're increasingly moving towards that. Now, the Taliban can be accommodated politically because they have a political interest. What is a challenge there, though, is the so-called Islamic State, what they call Daesh. Their pursuit of utopian caliphate goes beyond the state interest. It's supposed to spread, creating so-called Islamic State or the caliphate. It's not feasible. It's not going to be realizable. But unless the local circumstances are not addressed and they are ungoverned spaces and rooms for exploitations and grievances to exploit, it's going to be increasingly difficult for that part of the world going into Central Asia, because that grievance is not just in Afghanistan, it's both in Central Asia and Southeast Asia. It's going to be difficult. And the same is true with our neighbors in Somalia. If we cannot stabilize Somalia, it's going to be hard to defeat Al-Shabaab. So as much as we're fighting hard to protect our borders, because of the nature of the border interaction we have between Kenya and Somalia for the last 30 years, it's very difficult for us to actually claim safety and security without ensuring that our neighbors are also safe and secure. And the government in Mogadishu is stable.
Okay, Irongo, how would you see this being diluted in the long run, apart from the politics of it and the borders and the countries around it?
So I think, besides Afghanistan, we've seen, even on this show, we've discussed many times kind of the violence that we've seen in places like Iraq and Syria and Mali and Libya and other places. And I think what we have to conclude always is that extremism is not about identities, it's actually about ideas. It's a clash of ideology. And the more that we can create societies that are open, that guarantee freedoms and rights for women, that guarantee the right to life and free expression and open society principles, the more you reduce the space for terrorists and extremists to flourish. And that must be the ultimate focus of all of the nation building that we're doing globally. But besides ideas, I think the other thing that's really important is resources. We've talked a little bit about the redeployment of the administrative police to the border areas, and I think that work needs to continue and deepen. But I think the other thing is, we can welcome the U.S. donation that was made last week in terms of the armored personnel carriers, because we've seen too many of our officers essentially killed by improvised explosive devices. I think it's about 100 have lost their lives across this border with Somalia down to the coast. And I think besides ideas, I think we have to fight this war with resources.
Okay.
Let me chime in a bit, Gladys. I just wanted to make one adage here. It is important that our citizenry, our people understand that there are so many attacks and movements across the border that our security personnel have been able to thwart, and not just the one that was in February, earlier this year. So very important for people to understand that, because the problem is that when you just have one attack, then it looks like it's the 90%, because it's really screams and so on. I want to agree with Dr. Kanenje that the context matters. Afghanistan has been a place where proxy wars have been fought out right from the days of the Cold War. And there are a lot of, diverse ideological stances there that also cut across not only the Shiite Sunni divide, but also protracted differences within ethnicities that are within Afghanistan itself. And that really convolutes the entire picture. It's one of the places right now we think we've recorded about 3 or thereabout major bombing, suicide attacks in mosques, and it is really heartbreaking that some of those things are happening down there. But there is need for a political solution each time, because some of those fighters, some of them don't even believe in those things that they have been indoctrinated to talk about by the likes of Daesh and so on.
Okay,
So I just get something off my chest, and it goes back. So 2015, I was in a regional conference on countering violent extremism, and I was impromptu asked to speak. I had not prepared notes, but I was asked 15 minutes to go in front of 200 experts and talk about what was my view on what could be done in 2015. And the question that came to my head was, in 2015, is why is it that when terrorists attack us as a country, and we lose lives, soldiers or civilians, the outrage of Kenyans is first and foremost directed at the government, not at Al-Shabaab, right? And I said this in the meeting. And 4 years on, 3 years on, one of the things that occurs to me is that we don't actually connect with the duty that these officers are discharging when they essentially are protecting us on the borders or in our ports or in our cities. And part of the reason for that, I think, is an over-excessive security around the military project, around Somalia, around KDF. There is a thinking, I think, within the armed forces that actually the best way that you prosecute a war is to keep the public as ignorant as possible about the progress of the war. And I think that may be one argument, but I think the other responsibility, I mean, the responsibility I think our leaders have to take for that is it means that we are totally disconnected from the sacrifices. We are totally disconnected from the choices that they're making, and we are not able to help them. So we resist as individuals, and all our viewers watching now, we resist as much as possible that frisking that happens when you go into a mall or into a shop, and we actually see it as irritable and frustrating. And when we are not frisked, we actually feel that we've got a free pass. It's like, phew, those guys didn't check my bag today. You know?
Yeah.
I've saved 30 seconds, you know? And I think that's what we need to challenge ourselves a little bit more, is that this is not just a responsibility of our armed forces, it's actually a national responsibility. But the way it is being managed, it does not leave us the capacity to be able to see the importance of that and also how we plug into that. And therefore, in 2018, you can have 5 or 6 security officers killed, and there is no sense of outrage. None. Right? We have about 40,000 military veterans. Even that figure took me 5 conversations with several ex-military officers to get, how many veterans do we have in the country? Try Google it now, right? How many military veterans do we have? Just give me a reliable figure. That figure is not public knowledge.
Yeah.
So how do we honor them, right? How do we hold them in national stead? I was in the US, and I know you're going to tell me to stop at some point.
Yes.
I was in the US with, my father-in-law is a military veteran. He served in Vietnam. And he has this cap that says, I am a vet, right? And everywhere he walked, he was being honored, right? People would say, can we buy your entire family drinks, right? Can we pay for lunch? It happened 3 times in one trip. And I kind of felt, oh gosh, that's interesting. I have never had that experience in the Kenyan context, right? And I'm sure all the military veterans who are watching us now, and many of them, you know, they leave very early, huh? This is the other thing that I found when I was doing a bit of research on this, is that by the age of 30, and you know, we have one military veteran who usually sits on this panel. She'll tell you, by the age of 30, you know, many of them have actually left the armed forces. But for the next 30 years, or 50 years if they're lucky, they are not honored for that. So what is not happening?
It's a good thing that you brought up that conversation, because, as you know, the states marked Veterans Day just last week, and the numbers are 22% of those veterans actually take their lives after the fact. Correct. And people do not understand why it is that they do that. But the truth of the matter, for them, life after serving is very difficult. As you mentioned, in Kenya, we will go to the news and actually have instances where we'll speak of somebody who took their life and that of their family. But we always stop at that. We never dig deeper. When you think about it, maybe I can start with you, Kanenje. What is this that we have overlooked, as Irungu is putting across to us, in as far as putting a human face to these people that stand on guard on our behalf?
Gladys, I think our men and women in uniform are some of the most underappreciated public servants to this country. A lot of times, even when they fall in harm's way, after we send them to protect us, when they come back, their funerals are muted. Right. Their families, often there's little support after that, emotional, psychological, or financial. And as my colleague Irungu here has indicated, some of us who live in the United States for a very long time, we know and understand how proud the US is of their military men and women. You cannot honor what you don't know. Neither can you celebrate what you do not understand. And I think we should be a little bit more open. Most countries, ex-service men and women, sometimes they find themselves with PTSD. Okay.
Yes.
And that is the leading cause of suicide, including the United States. The difference is they actually have an active program in trying to make sure that these people go through a process. Now, I don't know to what extent we have that, or those services, to our men and women, especially after serving in some dangerous and horrible places, witnessing horrible things in places such as Somalia. When they come back, they are not normal. You cannot, you know, they're human beings. They are our children, they are our sons, our sisters and brothers, and our fathers. So they come from a system where they are perpetually either having to duck bullets and also being forced to kill, because in theater, sometimes if you're not killing, you're busy getting killed. So you have to do something about it. And then we expect them somehow, once they get out of service, just to move on like that. Number two, we have a responsibility as a country that when someone has served us for 5, 6, 10, 20 years, to put in place a mechanism of transition into normal civilian life, because they might have decided on their own volition to retire. However, what are they going to do? They come with a lot of experience. A lot of them are very highly disciplined men and women. Actually, they tend to be more disciplined, more patriotic than average Kenyan. Those boys and men and women in uniform. What do we have to ensure they actually remain relevant? Do we have a system where they can even go back to school after that, perhaps for more training? Now, and as a country, that is something we need to reflect, and as government, because we know generally, a lot of us are very reluctant to change. You know, change is not easy, change is difficult. We are used to the way things are. But to properly honor our men and women in uniform, and especially those, for instance, today who are serving in Somalia, you know, we have to have a deliberate program and policy to do that.
And speaking of which, you remember the Baragoi incident. I mean, we lost very many officers, and it's until just the other day that we took time to honor them years later. Dr. Omai, what does that say? I mean, I might not understand the system, but these are lives that were lost, and those were many lost at the same time.
I think it goes back to the question of how do we attach value to human life? And yes, countries like the US, of course, the veteran is so important. Europe, the whole of November, Europe is with poppies, all celebrating their heroes during the Second World War and the First World War. And it's every year. In Kenya, we, of course, we have even the embassies here going to honor their countrymen and women who died during those the world wars. Do we even honor our own? Because we had so many Africans fighting during the Second World War. Do we remember them? Do we honor them? So it's about also, how we need to start thinking about valuing ourselves first as Africans. I think we don't do enough of that. So valuing ourselves, valuing our veterans for that matter, and then and of course establishing a memory, because that's the only way you can make like the icons you see in America or in Europe. So memory, we don't even create a space for memory. It's usually ad hoc. For instance, we can have a space where we establish remembering, like, you remember the 147, the people, the police officers who died during the Garissa attack. Gallant, so reckless, good, and they did so much, but some are succumbed. So honoring such people, not just that one time we remembered them, every year, so it becomes part of our public memory. It's only then that even young people growing up, like in Europe or in America, will know, this is important. We should be thinking about our veterans that way. But I think it also goes back to history. Soon after independence, our own veterans, the Mau Mau, we banned them. Yeah? We refused to honor the Mau Mau. So it's only in 2002, is it, after the new Kibaki government, 2003, that we unbanned Mau Mau, and we started, they could even call themselves Mau Mau War veterans. Before that, they were just forgotten, and a bunch of gangsters actually referred to one former president. So it's very sad.
Yeah, it is. Ambassador Monja, we talked about the PTSD being the biggest issue that most veterans have to deal with the world over. But actually, interesting enough, out of that 22% that was saying they succumb or they actually take their own lives, a majority of them are actually women. And that is because there's much more that a woman officer has to deal with within the force amongst her own, that when she comes out, that apart, and also the war zone is a lot for them to deal with. My question is there anything in the system that actually puts in place systems that can help any of these veterans, and also look into the fact that maybe some would need more attention than others?
Yes, a very important question. Just to build on what my colleagues have said and in answer to your question. In fact, joining military in Western Hemisphere, in Europe or in US, is a prestigious service, and it is being used to take even away our young men and women who are joining, because the quickest route to getting a citizenship in some of those countries is to join the military. But while you are in the military, it's not just simply service, with helmets. They also create opportunities. Some of the opportunities, you have access to education so that you acquire skills, which means that after you graduate or if you leave the service, you have a vocation that you can fall back to. And that helps in the rehabilitation. Many of them, in fact, if you get in the US, it was, in fact, if you check even the US presidents who have been presidents, it was always, if you have a certain age and you hadn't served in Vietnam or anywhere, then you are an outcast. That was a prestigious, token to have. But once you have left the service, then the society looks after you. That helps a lot by being honored. But for women, as you asked, even in the, in some of those countries, if you look at the women, having come from this male-dominated, environment, the women go through a lot. Other than watching what happens in theater, killing and, ducking, guns and the rest, they also go through a lot of frustration in terms of harassment, sexual harassment and the rest. So when they leave, they feel really having been wasted. And if they don't get the society that receives them, many of them would have even, forgone having families, and it's so difficult to cope thereafter. So these are some of the things that should be considered when deployment, so that during the service there is time for them to continue to gain access to skills, but also once they return, give them preferences, particularly in jobs opportunities.
I hope those that are actually in charge are listening to this conversation. Very critical. Dr. Nzao, even as we close, in the Kenyan context, how best can we make sure that we not only honor our veterans, but also keep or put a face to these people that put their lives on the line for us?
Yeah, I think it begins with the society. Sometimes there's been this culture that when you have this child who does not perform so well, you say, can't they just go to the police and all that. We are trying to change that. It's not a place for rejects. It's a place for people we honor. There have been a number of important moves that we have done. For instance, at the Moi Air Base last year, sometime early last year, the CS and the entire military brass had a special arrangement for the widows of fallen soldiers, and there is a whole association and a kitty towards that process. The Kenya Defense Forces, for instance, has a very sound medical scheme and retirement scheme, which also works fairly well compared to other schemes out there. The head of state the other day been waiting just for Parliament to pass a robust insurance process for the police officers. We are glad now that they have an arrangement for the junior officers in the police to have allowances and so on. So the welfare side of things is becoming brighter as the days goes by, but also we have to accept that some countries are well endowed than others. I went to a military hospital, a veterans hospital, someplace in the U.S. It's like two times the size of Kenyatta Hospital, and then you find those countries have resources and so on. We have our own memorial hospital here that is enough. A lot of people from around the world have a lot of respect for it as practitioners down there. We really have to have a national culture that is very important, that honors our heroes, and that is a question of nationalism. One person, once we had an attack, and he just met some military person and said, we are feeling very sorry for you, sorry for the loss. But then the military person asked him, what about you? How are you feeling? What about you? Are you not part of the, you know, yeah. So you should feel the same way when we, and that is what Houghton was talking about. When our country is attacked, when our soldier falls in the line of duty, we should all feel it and live up to honor that person and so on. There are a number of settings where we have live issues, where attacks have just taken part in the contemporary past and they are still being handled and investigated. We may talk about things here, for example, about Kulbi War or El Ade or Janale or these other attacks down there, that where they are still really trying to track survivors. And up to now, they're trying to salvage, you know, some of the people who are still in. There are some of them who are still in captivity, and it's a very delicate issue to even talk about. That's why there's a little bit of dragging of the feet on some of these that are live issues, because they can jeopardize operations.
Okay, and speaking about incarceration, captivity, I think at this point, the panel that has been coming on Standing on Guard know about the circumstances surrounding the arrest of Peter Biya Rajak. And he was actually one of the panelists here on Standing on Guard. And the last show he actually did, he took us through the South Sudanese crisis. And for you who doesn't know about Peter Biya Rajak, he was arrested in South Sudan on July 28th. He is a youth advocate for peace and a friend and inspiration to many who know him around the world. He is currently being held without charge at the notorious South Sudanese prison known as a Blue House. So many were expecting that at this point, following the peace deal that was signed and a lot of political prisoners released, that he would be released too, but he actually still being incarcerated. And there has been a petition that was put together to get his release. And as you can see on your screen, it is targeting for 150,000 signatures. At this point, it is at 78,887. This comes over 100 days since Peter Biya Rajak was incarcerated in South Sudan. And the question is, why won't he be let go? And yet all he did was be very critical, especially of the bloated power sharing proposal that was being put across by IGAD. But we saw the signing of that, and peace seems to have come back to this country that has seen such a tumultuous past. So again, that hashtag Free Peter Biya Rajak still continues, even as we see how he can be released and for him to gain his freedom. Well, at this point, I thank my panel for joining me this morning and having a very, very good conversation around security matters both within and without the country. Dr. Mumonzao, Governance and National Security Strategist; Ambassador Erastus Mwencha, former Deputy Chair, AU Commission; Dr. Njoki Wamai, Assistant Professor, USIU International Relations; Dr. Hassan Kanenje, Director, Horn Institute; and of course, Irungu Houghton, who is the Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya. Gentlemen and lady, I will see you next week as we stand on guard right here on AM Live. My name is Gladys Gashanja. Stay tuned.